Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt. I write and perform this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, I'm a children's author, so you can buy a book by me, or you can buy me a coffee by going to buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. It's an easy way to make a small thank you gift to the show so I can keep kicking this can down the road. The podcast directory you're using right now should have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes, or you can type it into your browser. That's buymeacoffee.com/storiesrasprat. All contributions are gratefully appreciated. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. Okay, so before we get into it today, obviously you probably heard the promo before the episode starts. The Christmas shows are now on sale, so if you're interested in coming to those shows in Sydney, Brisbane or Canberra, then please do check out the links on the show notes or go to my website for more details. And the show in Perth, there's still tickets available to the second show for that. So again, go to the website or show notes if you want to get a ticket. All right, well, let's get into it. As I said last week, it's coming up on Book Week. In fact, tomorrow I head off on tour. I'm off to Canberra, and then I'm going all around New South Wales and Queensland visiting schools for the next 7 weeks. And at the end of that, actually, the 7th week, I'm recording an audiobook, so that's pretty exciting. I haven't done one all year yet, so very excited to get back in the studio and do that. So things will be a bit different. I'm at home right now, but I'm not sure where I'm going to be recording in the next couple of episodes. But today I'm doing another American folk story, but the next couple of weeks I'm probably going to read a chapter from Nanny Piggins, so that'll be pretty exciting too. But let's get into it now. Let's do today's story. So following on from last week's story of Paul Bunyan, I promised and I'm going to deliver. Here is the story of Johnny Appleseed as told by Nanny Piggins. Nanny Piggins, Boris and the children were sitting around the kitchen table eating apple pie. Nanny Piggins had not made the pie. She had sworn a vow never to make pie again because she was so good at making pies it was dangerous. But she was occasionally allowed to eat apple pie if she'd been particularly good and had not been arrested or attacked anyone for an unusually long time. Then she was allowed to consume one pie so long as she was strictly supervised by Boris, her 10-foot-tall ballet-dancing bear brother, who was the only one in the family strong enough to wrestle with her long enough for the children to call the police for help. The police sergeant also had to be informed in advance so he could have his men on standby just in case. The pie eating had proceeded remarkably smoothly. Nanny Piggins had eaten a large chocolate cake first, just to dull her appetite a little bit. Then she'd eaten one large family-sized apple pie baked by Hans the baker, while the children and Boris shared another family-sized apple pie. Nanny Piggins had insisted that they could each have a whole apple pie themselves, but Boris and the children knew they wouldn't be able to eat a whole pie as quickly as her. She would finish hers first, not be able to resist theirs, rip the pies out of their hands and run off into the garden to eat them up a tree. Then there would be a whole afternoon of shame crying, and they all wanted to avoid that. So, after guzzling down their pies in complete silence, Nanny Piggins insisted all truly delicious foods should be eaten in silence so you could really focus on the deliciousness of the experience. Nanny Piggins put down her spoon and sighed with satisfaction. This was the signal that they could now speak. "Yum," said Michael. "It was delicious," said Nanny Piggins. "Obviously not as good as a pie I made myself, but Hans put in an excellent effort. It's just a shame that I have such severe self-control issues where pie is concerned, and as a result, it isn't safe for us to eat it more often." "I thought that you thought that fruit ruined dessert," said Michael. "Usually it does," said Nanny Piggins, "but it's not the fruit's fault. It doesn't mean to, but there's something so healthy and nutritious about fruit, probably caused by all the vitamins and fibre that they contain, that does take the fun out of the sugar content. But I think that making it into a pie reforms the fruit, because pie pastry is just massive amounts of butter mixed with flour, and if you add that much butter to anything, it will always improve it." "You know, some people say an apple a day keeps the doctor away," quoted Samantha. "That is true," said Nanny Piggins. "It's especially effective if you throw the apples at the doctor as he or she approaches your house." "And why do people say things are as American as apple pie?" asked Derek. I'm not sure, said Nanny Piggins, because neither apples nor pie are American. Pie originated in Britain and Northern Europe and was taken to America from there. And apples originated in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, said Michael. Where's that? Next to Uzbekistan, said Nanny Piggins. I don't know where that is either, said Michael. It's between Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, said Nanny Piggins. Michael shook his head. Do you know where Russia is? Asked Nanny Piggins. Yes, said Michael. Well, the stans are all beneath Russia and to the left of China, said Nanny Piggins. OK, got it, said Michael. So nowhere near America, said Samantha. Exactly, said Nanny Piggins. But apples have been popular since the beginning. Adam and Eve got in trouble for eating an apple in the Garden of Eden. The Trojan War was triggered by an apple when two ancient Greek goddesses started fighting over it. And of course, Snow White was nearly taken out by a poisoned apple. Apples have been causing trouble throughout all the olden and ancient story days. But when you take an apple, cook it with sugar and put it in a pie with buttery, delicious pastry, you take a nice fruit that has occasionally triggered a war, and you raise it to a level of culinary delight that transforms it into a piece of art. Nanny Piggins dabbed a tear away here. Talking of pie always made her emotional. It's no wonder that Americans identify so strongly with apple pie, said Nanny Piggins. It's amazing more countries don't have the common sense to align themselves with a spectacularly delicious dessert. There would be much less war in the world if instead of fighting, world leaders got together and shared dessert recipes. The children nodded. They ate Nanny Piggins' cooking on a daily basis, so they knew this to be true. They could also imagine her running into a war zone with a freshly baked cake, leaping up on a tank, prizing open the hatch and throwing slices down to enemy combatants until they capitulated, which they would do instantly as soon as they took their first bite. But the American love of apples can be traced to one man, one of the great American forefathers, said Nanny Piggins. Who? Asked Derek. George Washington? Thomas Jefferson? Alexander Hamilton? Goodness, no. They were just politicians, said Nanny Piggins. I said a great American forefather. I'm talking about a man of real consequence who really did something to carve out that great nation. I'm talking about Johnny Appleseed. Who? Asked Samantha. Johnny Appleseed, said Nanny Piggins. He was an early pioneer from the olden American story days. Oh, I think I saw a cartoon about him, said Michael. Didn't he go around planting apple trees and talking to animals? Ha! Said Nanny Piggins. That's what he wanted people to think. I know the true story. Really? Said Derek. Yes, because Johnny Appleseed was a distant relative of mine, declared Nanny Piggins. You're kidding, said Michael. Was he a woman? Asked Samantha. And a pig? Asked Derek. Johnny Appleseed was not a woman, said Nanny Piggins, but he was a Piggins. In fact, Johnny Appleseed's real name was Bramwell Appleseed. Bramwell, exclaimed Derek. Like your no-good brother, Bramwell, asked Michael. And all the other Bramwells you've been related to throughout history, asked Samantha. Indeed, said Nanny Piggins. And Bramwell Appleseed wasn't really the great tree lover you read about in storybooks. He was, in fact, a great pie lover, devoted to eating as much apple pie as pigginly possible. He just loved apple pie? Asked Michael. Well, that is understandable, said Boris. Apple pie is delicious, especially if you pour a litre or two of honey on it. Absolutely, said Nanny Piggins. But Bramwell Piggins was so embarrassing that the family begged him to change his name to Johnny Appleseed. Because they were embarrassed by how much pie he ate? Asked Derek. Oh, no, they respected how much pie he ate, said Nanny Piggins. It's a delicious dessert. The Piggins family is full of eccentrics who devote their entire lives to eating a specific dessert. My own sister Anthea has been to prison several times for her apricot Danish-related crimes. No, the family was embarrassed by Bramwell, a.k.a. Johnny Appleseed, because he was not a snappy dresser. Huh? Said Michael. He was so obsessed with apple pie, said Nanny Piggins, he spent every cent he had on growing more apple trees to make more apple pie. As a result, he never spent any money on clothes. Well, a lot of people with not much money dress humbly, said Samantha. There was nothing humble about his clothes, said Nanny Piggins. His clothes were embarrassing. Well, how bad could they be? Asked Derek. He didn't wear a shirt, said Nanny Piggins. Instead, he wore a coffee sack with holes cut in the side for his arms to stick through. OK, well, that doesn't sound like it would look good, said Samantha, but at least it would smell nice. For a hat, he would wear a tin cooking pot on his head, said Nanny Piggins. Why? Asked Michael. Because he didn't believe in living in a house, said Nanny Piggins. He slept in the woods. He spent his whole life walking between his orchards, selling trees all across the Midwest, getting more and more people to grow apple trees so more and more apple pie would be made and hopefully eaten by him. That was his sole focus. He didn't waste time or money on anything else. All he took with him on his travels were the clothes he wore, his sack of apple seeds to plant, and a cooking pot to make his dinner. He didn't even have a bag. So he carried the cooking pot on his head. OK, well, that would look eccentric, said Derek. Then to top it off, he never wore shoes, said Nanny Piggins. Why? Asked Michael. Well, you've got to understand that Bramwell Johnny Appleseed was a very religious man, said Nanny Piggins. He believed all animals were God's creatures and, as such, they should be respected and treated with reverence. Well, you believe that too, said Samantha. Yes, but there are limits, said Nanny Piggins. Johnny Appleseed didn't wear shoes because one time, when he was wearing shoes, he accidentally stepped on a worm. And he was so devastated when he realised what he'd done to the poor worm that he cast off his shoes and vowed never to wear shoes again. But didn't his feet get cold in winter? Asked Derek. Yes, because he lived in the Midwest, which has incredibly cold winters, said Nanny Piggins. Well, surely he just lit a fire, said Michael. You would think so, said Nanny Piggins. But in the Midwest, there are also a lot of mosquitoes. And one time, when Johnny Appleseed had a campfire, the mosquitoes were flying about the flames, and some of them flew into the flames and died. Johnny Appleseed got so upset, he put out the fire because he didn't want to hurt any more mosquitoes. Well, I guess that was nice for the mosquitoes, said Derek. It was the Midwest, said Nanny Piggins. The mosquitoes were probably cold too, and they would have been annoyed when he put the fire out. But what happened to his feet? Asked Michael. If he was walking all the time and living outside in the snow and all the weather, they must have gotten really gross, said Samantha. Most likely they did, agreed Nanny Piggins. Mercifully, photography had not been invented yet, so we can't tell for sure. But legend has it, the soles of Johnny Appleseed's feet grew so tough and leathery that he could hold hot coals to his feet and stick needles in them without feeling a thing. But why would he do that in the first place? Asked Derek. Oh, he stuck hot coals on his feet and stuck them with pins to entertain the children, said Nanny Piggins. And children would find that entertaining? Asked Michael. Oh, yes, because there was no TV, computer games or internet back then. A man in a coffee sack with a tin pot on his head sticking pins in his feet was the highlight of their year. In fact, one time, a rattlesnake tried to bite Johnny Appleseed on the foot and he didn't even feel a thing. The rattlesnake came away with a toothache and didn't even dent the skin. So Johnny Appleseed lived a life of poverty because he was so obsessed with pie? Asked Samantha. No, that's not what I'm saying at all, said Nanny Piggins. Johnny Appleseed lived his dream life. I'll tell you the whole story. You see, at the time, in the olden American story days, Bramwell Johnny Appleseed was born in the frontier settlement of Massachusetts. That's at the top right-hand corner of America, the closest bit to England if you had to jump in the sea and swim over to England. Anyway, new settlers were arriving all the time from England and Europe, and with more and more people arriving, more and more people were moving out west to find their own land to set up their own farms and properties. Meanwhile, everyone in Massachusetts was getting thoroughly sick of Bramwell Appleseed always wanting to eat a slice of their apple pie. He'd annoyed a lot of people, so Bramwell decided to travel west too, to meet new people who didn't know how irritating he was yet. Most people travelling out west travelled in wagons, but because Bramwell Appleseed spent all his money on apple pie, he didn't have a wagon, and he set out on foot. And he took with him a big sack of apple seeds. But where did he get the seeds from? Asked Samantha. From a cider mill, said Nanny Piggins. You see, when they pressed the juice out of the apples to make cider, there were lots of seeds left over that nobody wanted. But Johnny Appleseed wanted them because Johnny wanted more apples. In one sack, he could carry thousands and thousands of seeds, and every seed could become an apple tree, and that apple tree could grow thousands of apples, which would in turn make thousands more seeds, all of which could lead to hundreds of thousands of pies. that other people would make and then hopefully share a slice with Bramwell. Anyway, that was the plan. So he set out. And the way he went about it was actually very clever. Bramwell Appleseed would travel as far as the furthest settlers had moved west. Then he would go on a little bit further west than them. When he got there, he'd find the best spot for farming and plant an orchard of apple trees using his seeds. Then, when the settlers moved out that way, he would already be there with his trees ready to sell to them, for them to plant on their farms. Well, that's pretty clever, said Derek. He did that year after year, said Nanny Piggins. He had a chain of apple tree nurseries across the Midwest, and he'd walk back and forth between them selling trees or trading the trees for clothes and meals. I thought you said he didn't wear proper clothes, said Michael. Oh, he never wore them, said Nanny Piggins. People gave him clothes and shoes hoping he'd make himself less of an eyesore. But he'd always give the clothes to people less fortunate than himself. Particularly if they had a slice of apple pie, they would give him in exchange. And over the years, he became a legend, said Nanny Piggins. Wearing a tin pot hat and a coffee sack, he was certainly recognisable. Everyone knew who he was. And because he travelled about so much, he always had stories to tell, often about his animal encounters when he was living alone in the woods. Really? Was he attacked by wolves or bears? Asked Michael. No, he claimed all animals loved him, said Nanny Piggins. But he was a Bramwell, so it's more likely that the animals were alarmed by his eccentric clothes and thought it best to stay away. So what happened to Johnny Appleseed in the end? Asked Samantha. Did he die in poverty? Oh no, said Nanny Piggins. He did exactly what he loved all the way up to the end. He spent his whole life travelling about selling apple trees. People thought he was poor because he had no house and no shoes and no proper clothes or even a hat that was a hat. But in fact, when he died, Johnny Appleseed had a massive property portfolio from all the orchards he planted over the years. His sister inherited 1,200 acres of apple orchards that he had planted all across the Midwest. Wow, said Samantha. But owning property was only a small part of his legacy, said Nanny Piggins. By the time Johnny Appleseed died, he had spent 50 years selling apple trees. That meant there were hundreds of thousands of acres of orchards grown from trees he sold. Everyone in the most remote pioneer settlements had apple trees, thanks to him, which meant there were apple pies galore all the way across the country. And as a result, to this day in America, you'll find apple pie eaten in homes and restaurants everywhere you go. All thanks to that one lunatic with a tin hat and a vision for bringing apple pie to every home in America, just so they could share a slice with him. Which just goes to show, children, so much in this world is achieved by lunatics with a vision. The end. Time for bed. Okay, well, that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed that one. I enjoyed researching it and telling it to you. So that's it for now. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.